She was small enough to disappear into the shadow of a subway grate, and she had learned how to be unseen like a skill, practiced and clean, like hiding a photograph in the pages of a library book. Tonight the air tasted of iron and hot steam, and the city moved with that late-evening impatience that turns millionaires into hurried shadows and leaves the hungry looking for tomorrow's scrap. Mia Alvarez folded her hands against the threadbare coat at her chest and watched the man in the charcoal overcoat cross the corner of Atlantic and Court like a black tide. He wore a gold watch that caught the streetlight and spat it back in quick, unreadable flashes. He walked with the kind of certainty reserved for people who had eaten other people's fear and called it breakfast. She had been following him for 3 nights. Tonight she would do something she hadn't expected to do, and the idea tightened like a wire around her ribs. She had a note folded small enough to fit between 2 fingers, the handwriting a hurried, childish scrawl she had practiced until it looked like hers without betraying her desperation. The paper smelled faintly of old coffee because she had printed it on a receipt from the diner where she'd slept, the letters dark and blunt. You stopped my father from coming home. Tell me where he is. Meet me at the gray bench by the river at dawn if you have an ounce of decency left. M.A. She clasped the medallion beneath her shirt, the cool oval warmed by her skin, a tarnished coin with a face she had traced with her tongue since she was 6. The medallion had been the last thing her mother left in her palm. It had a tiny engraving on the back she could never decipher, but kept like a promise. It was why she was standing there, feet aching, because the only thing worse than being hungry was not knowing why someone took everything that mattered. He was Vincent Morty to the world that mattered, Vince to the men who kept their hands stained, and the people in suits who were paid to pretend they didn't know anything about his nights. He was a name in the drawer of a judge's memory. He had a watch with a scratch across its face where, someone once joked, time had caught him cheating. He had a photograph pinned above his desk in the penthouse office, a sepia of a young man and a laughing woman clasping a child between them. The man looked like him then, softer. Vince moved through the city with the economy of a man who had learned to buy silence instead of pleading for it. When Mia's note slipped into his pocket, not by accident, but by the practiced hand of someone who could blend into gutters and subway ads, he stopped walking in the middle of the city like the world had just forgotten to turn. He felt the paper first as weight, the tiny hitch you feel when someone else's intent intrudes on a routine. Then he read it under the halo of a street lamp, the words small and urgent against the grease-stiff receipt. You stopped my father from coming home. He stopped because the name on the back of the medallion she had dropped, her fingers had slipped, was a name he had not heard aloud in 20 years. He had kept promises he had never owned out of habit. He felt his chest go hollow in a way that had nothing to do with bullets or threats. People who had killed him 1,000 times in the newspapers had never done what a scrap of paper could do. Suggest that the past was not done with him. He folded the note, tucking it into the inner breast pocket of his coat, and kept walking, because stopping was dangerous if you didn't want the world to watch you crumble. Mia watched him from the alley across the street, hands gripping the medallion so hard that the chain bit into her palm. She had watched him since he left the courthouse yesterday, watched him give a curt nod to men whose faces meant negotiation and fire. She told herself she would be brave enough to plant a seed that could grow roots into an answer. But bravery is a kind of math that addresses only half the equation. The rest is luck, and the city was stingy with that. She walked forward, the soles of her shoes wet with melted snow, and for a moment she could hear only the sound of her own breathing, small and ragged. They moved toward different operas of life, him to a building with a doorman who knew to bend and not ask questions, her to a shelter where the fluorescent lights hummed like trapped bees. She learned, the hard way, who a city would believe. The man in a suit with a ledger is credible, the girl who sleeps under overpasses is not. But the medallion had its own memory, and that memory was what drove her. She had a photograph in the inside pocket of her coat, a torn, folded image of a woman with seafoam hair and a smile that didn't know how long she'd stay. There was a man in the photo, too, his arms slung around the woman. He looked like Vincent, except the jaw was softer, the eyes too young for the hardness she knew now. She had seen the same photograph in the background of a press story on an old charity gala. Vince with a different name attached, a name they had not printed because some things had been carved out of the public record on purpose. On the second day after she slipped the note, the city gave Mia a quick, simple answer. A busker's guitar, a shout, a shove, and the cold realization that curiosity is dangerous when you don't belong to anybody. She was shoved to the pavement behind a coffee shop, a wallet rifled from her pocket by hands that left a purple bruise across her knuckles. The medallion skittered across the cement and stopped under the lip of a storm drain, glinting like a promise out of reach. She crawled across the ground and felt the gravel cut into her knees. The taste of iron filled her mouth. It was the city's flavor. A hand came down on her shoulder, and she looked up to see a man with tired eyes and a badge that belonged to the NYPD. He was smaller up close, more human. "You okay, kid?" he asked, and she lied because some lies are kinder than the truth. The man's name was Alvarez, too, a coincidence or a cruel hint. Detective Raul Alvarez, a man who had swapped wedding bands for case files and worked nights like a monk prays. He asked questions with the patience of someone who had long ago learned that questions sometimes cost less than answers. He took the medallion when she showed him and turned it over in calloused fingers, whistling once. "This is older than you, kid," he said. "Where'd you get it?" She said it had been her mother's, and that was enough for now. He watched her like a man watching someone start to fall and then not, and told her, "If Vince Morty's involved, you don't walk alone." His voice was a soft warning. She swallowed. "I'm not sleeping alone anymore," she said, which was not the same thing and not even close to the truth. A hospital scene came first in the way fear always comes first before logic. Fast and panicked and smelling of antiseptic. She had been hit the week after the medallion went missing, shoved through a doorway and struck hard enough to bleed into the hairline above her ear. She woke to fluorescent light and machines making small, steady promises she wasn't sure she deserved. The scent of disinfectant and the sharp tang of blood were the first things she registered before the face of a night nurse. Young, efficient, and the steady presence of a doctor who kept checking her pupils with a penlight. She learned, in that white room with the curtain drawn, that being hurt makes you visible in ways streetwise invisibility could never achieve. Her story entered the hospital's ledger. Name unknown, brought in by police. Someone else had been brought in the same night with a different kind of wound. A man with a judge's name in his phone. A bullet grazed along his side, and he kept asking through the morphine for a ring he had lost. The watch on his wrist had a scratch that looked familiar to someone who had just left a receipt in a coat. Vince Morty did not visit hospitals for charity. He visited because somewhere inside him, a pocket of conscience had not yet been paid off. He let himself be poured like dark coffee into the sterile waiting room, and he came with an envelope of cash that could fix the splintered things money sometimes fixed. Silence, movement, minutes. He looked at Mia in the bed, small and stubborn in a blanket that smelled of hospital soap and other people's pain. And something like recognition crossed his features, so small it might have been nothing but recognition of how fragile certain things were. He saw the medallion chain on the nightstand. Someone had turned it over. It glinted in the light like an unintended confession. He did not move to touch it. He had lost things before, faces, loyalties, time, and had always paid to put the pieces back in neat boxes. But the presence of a child in a hospital bed tugged at a place inside him that had been anesthetized with years of other people's needs. Detective Alvarez watched Morty tilt his head at the medallion, and for the first time since his patrol days, felt the thin line between power and fear. Outside the hospital, a reporter clicked at her keyboard, making the city's urgency smaller, more chiseled into headlines. Inside, a nurse adjusted an IV drip and said, "She's awake." Mia opened her eyes and found Vince looking at her as if she were a problem he had not yet been paid to solve. His voice was the softest thing that had any right to be soft in his company. "How'd you come by this?" he asked. She thought of the note in his pocket that had stopped him in his tracks, the note that had been the first arrow in a quiver she did not possess. She thought of the photograph in her pocket, the torn edges of it like invitations. She answered with the truth she had been practicing since she was small. "It belonged to my mother." That simple sentence widened the room. It unfolded into something that smelled of old promises. Morty's jaw clenched in a way that made his knuckles white against the arm of the chair. He had a ring on his finger that had been polished until it shone, a signet carved with an emblem she recognized from the photograph. The same crest, the same hand. It was a motif that would not let go. The photograph, the medallion, the watch, the ledger, the ring, the first of 5 objects that would carry the story with the way a river carries stones. Each of them was a key with teeth that would somewhere down the line fit into a door they had not yet found. Shortly after, a folder found its way into Mia's hands in the most unlikely of places. A church basement where a community pantry kept boxes of donated coats. She was looking for food and found, instead, a hidden envelope stuffed between hymnals. Inside were old receipts, a canceled check, and a torn piece of a ledger page. A ledger that had the sorts of figures that made sense if you were balancing guilt and profit together. The entries were in a careful hand, a hand that matched the signature she had once seen in the back of a charity gala program. There was a small coffee stain in the corner and a note that read, in hurried script, "For when the past needs accounting." She folded the paper into her pocket next to the photograph of her mother and the man. The paper smelled of dust and time. It told her, without saying much, that something larger had been carefully hidden and that she had just pried up one corner. It would not be long before the ledger, the full ledger, not the torn piece she had found, became a weapon in the hands of people who litigated their lives with money and fear. A secret room would be discovered later. A wall panel knocked loose in a Morty-owned warehouse where boxes of imported textiles were stacked to the ceiling. Inside that wall, behind chicken wire, sat a small safe and a folder labeled in someone else's tidy script with a name Mia recognized. When Detective Alvarez kicked the panel loose on a rainy Tuesday, the smell of old paper released like trapped breath. The ledger itself was heavy, its pages thick with names and numbers, with dates that could be cross-referenced to hospital bills and to bank transfers that blurred like smoke. One line in particular made Mia's hands go cold. A payment to a St. Mary's clinic, dated the same month her mother vanished. The ledger had been sitting there like a secret waiting for someone careless enough to forget its weight. Vince Morty's men moved like shadows when the ledger was found. Men in dark coats whispered numbers into phones. There was the rustle of newspapers and the way the city held its breath for an evening. Eyes that had never feared the law now assessed the ledger as if it were a lit fuse. People started to look for things they had misplaced. A watch disappearing from a dresser, a photograph found under a sofa cushion, a ring suddenly absent from a jewelry box. The ledger had named people who should not be named. It had tied small charity donations to larger withdrawals, tied transfers to midnight addresses, tied promises to the names of men and women who had subsequently lost the ability to speak. For Mia, the ledger made a map of theft, and she traced its lines like someone reading a confession left in the dark. The first micro-reveal came when Vince, in a rare sliver of honesty, admitted in a private conversation with Detective Alvarez that he had known Mia's mother by a different name. It was a small admission, tossed across a table like a bone, and it altered trajectories. He said he had loved her once, not in a way that redeemed him, but in a way that explained a fracture that had never been smoothed. He described a charity drive in a hall full of red velvet and bad champagne, and a woman who danced like she had somewhere else to be. He described a medallion he had given as a token, not knowing the way such tokens could carry the weight of future claims. Mia listened to him speak about her mother through the mouth of a man who had been taught to measure everything in leverage and lost things in ways she did not understand. His voice trembled when he said the woman's name, soft as a door closing. Someone in the Morty organization, a man who owed more debts than morality, was unwise enough to believe that threats could be solved with small gestures. They sent a message to Mia, a flat envelope with a single line of type written across the inside. Stop. It wasn't a threat as much as a test. Mia pinned the note to the jacket she wore and carried it around like a medal because it was proof that someone had noticed. She had to be smarter now. She had to recalibrate survival into strategy. She started to watch for patterns. The way the city's pigeons took off when a car pulled up, the cadence of the doorman at Morty's building, the way the laundry across the street dried like a metronome in the wind. She learned the names of the men who stood at corners with watches like lit compasses, and she learned which of them liked cigars rolled in a particular way. The interrogation came next, not in a police room with a one-way mirror, but in the back of a diner with a jukebox and a fluorescent hum. A Morty lieutenant named Sal, a man who smelled of lemon cologne and permanent compromise, met Mia under the pretense of buying her coffee. His face was pocked and kind in the way men without conscience sometimes are. He leaned in and asked why she had slipped a note into the boss's coat. He wanted to know what she intended. She told him the story she had rehearsed, the medallion, the photograph, the need to know where her mother had gone. He watched her hands across the table, and then, in a moment that could have been tenderness or threat, he told her something that unspooled the tightest thread of her life. The woman in her photograph had been married, once, to a man whose name appeared more than once in the ledger, and that man had disappeared the same month Mia's mother vanished. Sal's confession, when it came, arrived by degrees. He spoke of a night on the docks, of whispered deals and a crate that never reached its destination. He laughed then, a small, ugly sound, and told her that sometimes people were paid to move and paid again to forget. He said, "You think you want answers, kid. You don't know what answers look like. They look like broken things." The interrogation was a betrayal because Sal was both messenger and executioner. He pushed Mia into a corner, and then left because people like Sal never stay to clean up the mess they make. Mia left the diner with a new map in her pocket and a deeper certainty that the ledger did not stop at numbers, but stretched like a web into houses and courtrooms and hospital bills. The second reveal, medium in scope, came when Detective Alvarez found a notation in the ledger. The initials VM adjacent to a line item that read transfers. Health expense, St. Mary's Clinic. The line was dated 3 years before Mia was born. He showed it to Mia as if the spreadsheet in his hands were a relic. She sat at his kitchen table in a coat that smelled of smoke and coffee, and they traced the ink with their fingers like readers searching for the missing end to a sentence. "Why would he pay to a clinic he didn't use?" Raoul asked aloud. His voice had the tired cadence of men who kept balance sheets in their heads. Mia thought of the photograph, of the woman's seafoam hair and the young man's arm. She thought of a ledger that had an entry for everything, and of the way names could be erased when you had enough people willing to look away. Ambushes happen when histories get too loud. They are the city's way of silencing questions with physicality. Mia was taken one night from the bench by the river, where she had been waiting for a meeting that never happened. 2 men who smelled of cheap cologne and diesel snatched her into a van that reeked of fear and fast food. Cloth pressed against her mouth, and she had the small, clear panic of someone who had not practiced absence in that particular shape. They drove along a freeway that hummed like a stringed instrument and dropped her in a warehouse cleared of its inventory and cold as a slab. She was left in a room that smelled of rust and old dust, the only light a single bulb that swung like a second hand. The ambush was not a murder attempt. It was a message. Stop digging or be swallowed. They left a watch on the table, Vince's watch with the scratch across its face. It ticked like a metronome for the city's cruelty. She managed, through a combination of will and small, learned cunning, to pry at the door and slip out into the night. She ran across an empty lot with gravel tearing at her soles and found a subway that coughed and took her away. Knees bleeding, breaths like file cards, she realized that being brave was less a quality than a sequence of choices. She chose to keep going. She would not be bought into silence. She thought of the hospital's drip lines and the ledger's numbers. Her thumb found the photograph in her pocket and smoothed the torn edges until her fingers ached. The mid-story twist, the game changer, came because blood has a way of making secrets insist on being seen. A DNA test, ordered by an overzealous young forensic tech with a soft spot for underdogs and truth, confirmed that the woman in the photograph had given birth to Mia. The result connected Mia to a name Vince had never meant to let resurface. It tied the medallion to a family line and placed Mia squarely in the path of someone who had learned to erase people like a bad check. The ledger lines that once read like numbers resolved into faces and relationships. Mia's breath left her chest like dropping through a trapdoor. Detective Alvarez closed his eyes and muttered, "Jesus!" The ledger had always been a ledger. Now it became a family album annotated with payments and excuses. Once the DNA result existed, the city sharpened. Reporters smelled it in the air like spring after winter. Scandal, legacy, the private failures of men who had tried to keep their hands clean by paying others to do the dirty work. Vince had to make a decision in the public pressure that followed. Deny or mend the fracture his life had helped make. Denial would have been his instinct, always had been, but the situation now had the fragile architecture of both legal jeopardy and personal ties. He lost control in a hospital corridor one night when someone played for him a voicemail on loop. The cadence of his wife's laugh, the last time he had heard it before she walked away. His hands went slack, and he began to sob like a man who had been taught his whole life that men did not cry. His colleagues gave him space, but no mercy. That scene was not violent in the way the streets are violent. It was violent because it exposed him. The ring on his finger had been removed and placed on the nurse's station by a woman who did not look like she cared for the symbolism, but understood the power. The story escalated into action. A raid at dawn when the FBI, tipped by a federal agent who had a dogged dislike of organized crime, swept into one of Morty's warehouses. Flashbangs cracked like thunder in the pre-dawn air. Officials moved in a choreography practiced for legality. Men with badges read rights like prayer. The ledger, metamorphosing from private accounting to probable cause, sat on a table beneath a lamp with its numbers now highlighted in red. Beyond the warehouse windows, the river carried the pale sun like a coin into the city. The public payoff was not an instant collapse. Power dissolves slowly, like a stain in water, but the FBI could carve away at the edges. Arrests were made that day and more would be lined up like dominoes in the weeks to come. In the interrogation room that followed the raids, betrayals were laid out like a deck of cards and then shuffled into new hands. Sal, who had bought coffee like a friendship and smiled like a sin, turned state's witness after the ledger was used as leverage against him. He told the FBI what his role had been and named names in exchange for immunity. He described shipments that never left port, payments that went to offshore accounts, a watch passed like a talisman between men. He described a ring that was given to a woman as a fake promise, a ring that bore the same crest as the medallion. "We thought we were buying loyalty," he said in the cold fluorescent light, "but we were just paying people to look the other way." The betrayal split the organization in slow, merciless ways, because being a criminal is often about choosing which laws you will not follow, and those lines shift when one of your own begins to talk. Mia had to face him after that, not in a courtroom, but in a cramped office where Vince had agreed, oddly, to meet her. He was a man who had learned the weight of apologies and hoarded them like currency. In his face, you could read an education in regret. He told her about a time years ago when her mother's laughter had almost undone him. He told her that he had thought he had protected her mother by moving money and creating distance, that the ledger entries were attempts to hide and heal at once. But there is a difference between healing and hiding, and he had mistaken expenditure for atonement. He confessed things he had not meant to say, small truths that landed heavier than bullets. When she stood up to him for the first time, she did not speak with a trembling voice. She pressed the photograph between her palms and said, "I was hungry, Vincent. I still am. But I am not here to be saved by you." She demanded answers, not money. That scene was the moment he lost emotional control in a new way, not by violence, but by the unmaking of his careful illusions. He did not strike. He fell apart. His face, usually armored, crumbled in front of her. He touched the medallion, as if in the action he could reconnect past to present. "You have a right to be angry," he said, voice fraying. "You have every right." The ring on his finger caught a slant of light and split it. He took off the signet ring and set it on the table between them. For a heartbeat, it looked like an offering, or perhaps a surrender. Mia's throat tightened. The ring felt like a new kind of ledger, a record of promises made and broken. Her standing up to him meant she refused both charity and coercion. She told him she wanted the truth, not a check. She wanted to know why her mother had been left, what incurred the payments to St. Mary's Clinic, and whether anyone had been paid to make a person disappear. He hesitated because the truth would unspool more than he had considered. He finally told her about a confrontation he had had with a man who matched the man in the photograph, a man who had been in debt to the organization and whose absence had been convenient. "We thought he fled," he said quietly. "We thought he took the money and ran. We paid to make the story simple." That admission lodged in Mia's chest like a stone. Simple stories are often the most murderous. The FBI built its case with the ledger as its spine, the watch as supporting evidence, Sal's testimony as a ligament, and the ring as the connective tissue linking family to organization. The public's appetite was sharpened by the nightly news. Pundits chewed on the idea of a kingpin who had fathered a child and then kept the truth clean by ledger entries and whispers. Law and headlines have different speeds. Indictments moved like seasons, and sometimes justice is a weather pattern you have to wait out. But the personal landscape shifted faster. Vince began to hand over small pieces of his life that had been hoarded behind silence. He gave investigators signed checks, names on lists, and details that made the ledger's architecture look less like math and more like confession. There was an ambush in the courthouse parking lot, an attempt to silence witnesses that failed, because some people had finally become too visible to be ignored. Tires screamed, men in coats moved with purpose, but were stopped by the quickness of uniformed officers. A flash of motion and a hand gone wrong left a bullet lodged in a car door, the sound cratered into subsequent headlines. People started to understand that the ledger wasn't only paper, it had teeth. The public payoff took the shape of a trial charging individuals with racketeering, with money laundering, with coercion. It was messy and glorious and ugly all at once, like the city itself. Mia's personal payoff, what she had carried for years in the small coin of a medallion and a photograph, came in the way families sometimes find pieces of themselves in the detritus of other people's accounts. DNA confirmed blood ties, the ledger confirmed intent, the watch confirmed moments when people had been together, the ring confirmed promises given and taken, and the photograph confirmed a life that had once been ordinary and had been made complicated by men who thought their ledger entries could erase consequences. Vince took a plea on some charges to avoid a prolonged trial. He would see a reduced sentence for cooperation. His empire would be carved up. The public saw legal resolution like a theater play with predictable acts. But for Mia, the resolution had to be personal. She testified in a courtroom that smelled of lemon cleaner and old wood, and the sound of her voice was steady. She read from memory the shape of her mother's smile, the details of the ledger that made her family into a thing someone had tried to buy. She described, with the rawness of someone who had been hungry for answers, how each motif, the medallion her mother left, the photograph folded in a pocket, Vince's scratched watch, the ring given and later hidden, the ledger that kept tally of human transactions, had been a breadcrumb trail she had followed. She didn't ask the court for vindication. She asked for truth. Her testimony landed, not like vengeance, but like a bell calling people to a reckoning they had avoided. Vince's loss of control became public in a way he could not have foreseen. He had always controlled narratives, given money to make stories end cleanly, but the public's scrutiny was an unforgiving magnifying glass. In a televised interview, he tried to explain his actions, framed them as a mixture of misguided protection and complicity. There, on camera, he cried for the first time the city could see, and people watched a man who wore power like armor suddenly standing naked to the world. Some called it manipulation, others called it humanity. Mia watched from a bench outside the courthouse, sunlight catching the edge of her medallion, and felt an odd lightness as if the ledger's lines had become less suffocating. The climax came in two movements, the legal and the personal. The legal had the slow, institutional rhythm of indictments and plea bargains. The personal came quicker, a small, intimate confrontation one evening in the garden behind an old parish where Mia had gone to think. Vince waited there, not surrounded by henchmen, but by a silence he had earned and a small bouquet of yellow roses that looked absurd against his dark suit. He offered them to her, hands shaking. "I thought I fixed it," he said. "I thought I could bury things and the earth would forgive me." She let him speak, and then, standing in the low light, she did something that felt terrifying and enormous. She asked him what he would do if he had to choose between the ledger and the truth. He looked at her as if the question had a weight he had never been taught to carry. He took off his watch and set it beside the medallion on the stone wall. He placed his ring next to the photograph she had kept folded in her purse. It was not surrender so much as acknowledgement. He confessed in a way that required him to name the ledger's arbiters and sign a page with his own hand, and the notes that followed would become part of the prosecution's file. He had to face what he had been, a man who believed he could arrange grief into a ledger entry. Now he had to live with the pages made public. The personal payoff was not a tidy reconciliation. It was the beginning of an exchange where apologies could be measured not in cash, but in small, consistent acts. Mia's life changed in practical ways. She moved into a small apartment paid for by a fund set up anonymously by people who believed in second chances and who had been moved by public testimony. It was not charity so much as community. She found work at a community clinic that reminded her of the ledger's footnote to St. Mary's, a place where people like her could be treated without being judged. She kept the medallion in a small box on a shelf beside the photograph. Detective Alvarez became a kind of uncle, a person who checked in with a casserole or a joke, who understood that protection does not preclude boundaries. The watch and the ring entered the court's evidence room and later were auctioned as part of restitution. Their upswing into public commodity did not bother Mia. Objects are not people, she thought. They hold memory but not heart. There was a small, quiet scene months later when Mia walked into the hospital where, years before, she had woken under fluorescent lights. She carried a paper coffee cup and a notebook she used for the clinic's scheduling. She walked to the bed where an elderly woman with seafoam hair slept, a patient who reminded her of the woman in the photograph, though years had painted differences across their faces. She touched the woman's hand, small and papery, and sat. The medallion in her pocket warmed against her chest like a living thing. She had moments of fragility where the ledger's numbers would press at her sternum, and she would step outside to breathe. But then she would remember the way the city had 1,000 small kindnesses tucked under its cynical sleeve. The final reveal tied the motifs together at a family table in a place that smelled of fresh bread. Vince, who had taken a plea but not full guilt, visited the clinic under supervision and sat across from Mia. He wore a plain shirt, no signet ring on his hand now, and his watch was a cheap model with no scratch, as if in the smallest possible way he was trying to remake himself. He placed a folded sheet of the ledger on the table and slid it toward her, a copy, redacted but still carrying names. He said, "Those names are not just ledgers, they're people. I want to help make them right." It was both admission and request. Mia looked at the paper and then at him. The photograph rested between them like an artifact. She picked up the medallion and, in a moment of both currency and ritual, she pressed it into his palm. "You kept the wrong kinds of accounts," she said. "You can start keeping different ones." He met her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, a man who had measured life in ledgers seemed willing to risk another measure. Time spent making amends rather than rounding numbers. The public payoff continued to unfold outside the clinic. Fines, restitution, prison time for certain men, community service for others, and a slow unwinding of power structures. The personal payoff, quiet and stubborn, was Mia building a life that included volunteering to tutor children who had lived on the margins, taking a class at night in nonprofit management, and sleeping without the calculated tension of a body constantly ready for attack. Months later, on a spring afternoon, a child in the clinic's waiting room pointed to the medallion on Mia's shelf and asked about it. She told the story simply, that it had belonged to her mother, and that sometimes objects hold pieces of people we love. The child asked why she had kept it instead of selling it, and Mia said, "Some things are worth more than money." She did not say that sometimes the thing they were worth is the way they remind us of what we refuse to let go of: family, truth, and the stubbornness to ask for justice, even when it seems like a small, foolish thing to do. The ledger remained in the courthouse records, red-stamped and annotated. The watch and the ring became evidence entries that numbered into the public. Sal lived in a witness protection program with a new name and the weight of the choices he had made, and Detective Alvarez retired with a neat file full of resolved cases and a bad back. Mia found herself answering questions from reporters she used to avoid. She learned to deflect the sensational and say, instead, that she wanted to help make sure no other child felt like they were bargaining their life for someone else's silence. Time, as the scratched watch had once measured, moved on. However, the scars of the ledger did not vanish. There were nights when the city hummed, and she would awake with the taste of metallic fear in her mouth and reach for nothing and find a medallion instead. She would run her thumb over its worn face and remember the bench by the river and the note that had stopped a man in his tracks. It had been the smallest of acts, a folded scrap of paper placed in a pocket, and yet it had rolled into consequences that changed legal records and personal lives. She had asked for truth and received more than truth, a reckoning. In the epilogue of Ordinary Days, there was a Thanksgiving she helped organize at the clinic for people who had nowhere else to go. Vince did not attend. Some things require more than one harvest to forgive. But a man who had once believed he could buy silence donated funds earmarked to expand the clinic's pediatric wing. His name buried in a list that had been a ledger but now read like a footnote of atonement. He sent, instead, a letter in which he wrote, with hands that had learned to tremble, "I am sorry." Mia read the letter in the kitchen of her small apartment, the medallion warm beneath her shirt. She did not respond with anger. She responded with the steady, pragmatic thing she had learned to wield: boundaries. She used the funds to help others. At the end, it was not a clean victory because few victories are when lives get rewritten around ledger pages. It was messy and human, and complete in the way that life can be when you trade retribution for repair. Mia stood one day by the river where she had once waited at dawn and let the sun flatten the city's jagged edges. She wore her medallion on a new chain, polished but not bright, as if to say remember but not worship. She had the photograph in a frame on her bookshelf now, faded but whole. Detective Alvarez waved from across the bridge and she waved back. There were scars, and there were songs to hum while one stitched them closed. She had gotten answers, but more importantly, she had found a life where she could be asked for things that weren't always survival. And somewhere in a small courtroom archive, a ledger lay open, a testimony folded into it like a note once slipped into a pocket. The men who had kept their accounts in silence found themselves enumerated like footnotes in a larger story. The public had watched a kingpin's fall with the voraciousness of a city that knows spectacle, and then turned back to its ordinary obligations. The personal had been quieter. A girl who had once been homeless had, and would continue to build a life anchored not in the ledgers of others, but in the family she took for herself. Friends, co-workers, a man named Raoul with a patient smile who brought casserole, a child she tutored who learned to read without fear, a small apartment that smelled of bread and the soup she had learned to make in order to keep warm. There were nights she would still wake with the memory of being shoved into a van and the bulbs swinging like a heart, but now she woke to light pouring through curtains and the sound of a radio on low. She had taken the medallion to a jeweler once, asking him only to polish it so the face could be clearer. He asked what it meant, and she said, "It means someone's been lost, and they shouldn't have been." He nodded with the kind of quiet empathy strangers sometimes give each other. The coin shimmered in his palm, no longer a secret but a bridge. In the end, Vincent Morty's empire had been reduced to a few numbered boxes and legal terminologies. The people it had hurt by ledger entries sought, in the only ways institutions would allow, restitution and recognition. Mia found herself at a community board, arguing for funds so children could get vaccinated and not be priced out of health. She thought about how her own ledger of experiences had balanced itself in small, stubborn increments. One seed planted at the river bench, one hospital visit, one found photograph, one torn ledger page. Each motif, the medallion, the photograph, the watch, the ring, the ledger, had been a bead on the same string. And when she laid them out now, they formed a narrative that was neither wholly tragic nor merely triumphant but real, like a city block slowly reconnected brick by brick. She never stopped feeling the ache that had set her on that path, but it became something that reminded her to move forward rather than a weight that pulled her under. She taught children that names matter, and that sometimes the smallest note slipped into an overcoat can stop a man from walking away from what he owes. She had asked for truth and received it in pieces, in court transcripts, in a stranger's confession, in a ring placed on a table, in a watch set aside. And she had turned that truth into the work of helping others reclaim their own accounts. The ledger might always exist in the public ledger of history, but Mia's story lived now in the ordinary ledgers of groceries bought and classes attended, and in a photograph hung on a wall where a child might see a different kind of future. When she touched the medallion now, it did not spark the same hunger but a more complex, softer longing hunger mitigated by action, by work, by the company of people who would not look away. The city kept breathing all around her, indifferent and generous in turns. She learned to keep walking in a different way, not with the edges that keep you dangerous, but with the steadiness of someone who had been counted and who had learned to count back.